a number of things that I'm going to say may sound familiar to you. Just, I believe, 6 weeks ago, my friend and colleague Kamal Badrashani gave a lecture here in this same venue, and he had a more general, he provided a more general approach to the early Bronze Age on the Lebanese coast. So there will be some repetitions and duplications, but in my talk today, I want to focus on specifically one site, Fadous-Kfarabida. So I hope it will not totally be redundant, what I have to say. Wait. And now I have a problem because, yeah. So, as you can see on the map to your left, this map gives an overview of the most important early Bronze Age sites that have been excavated in Lebanon so far. And the very noticeable thing is that all these sites are located on the coast. The Bekaa, this vast plain between the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountains, is conspicuously empty. This is, of course, not a reflection of the past reality. It just shows us that so far, none of the excavations conducted in the Bekaa have reached early Bronze Age levels. And we are hoping in our current work in Baalbek to go through the Middle Bronze Age, where we are currently at, and reach the early Bronze Age levels, so at least to get a glimpse in what is happening in the hinterland. So the site of Fadous-Kfarabida is located directly on the coast, just 12 kilometers north of Byblos and 4 kilometers south of Tel Kuba, the site where Kamal Badrashani, Graham Phillip, and my colleague Helen Sader are currently working. So this is actually quite exciting, that we do not just deal with one site in isolation, but we have a number of sites from the same time period that can be linked to each other. So coming to Fadous-Kfarabida, I'm now on the right-hand picture. We see here a satellite image from the 1960s where the site is still relatively intact. It is a surprisingly small site, just 1.5 hectares in size. And in the 1960s, it was only, let's say, very little damaged by the railway line to the east and the coastal road to the west. Now, if we move on to the current state, so the map on the left here shows the situation in 2004 when we started exploring the site, you will see that things have deteriorated considerably. The railway line in the east is still there. The coastal road in the west is still there, but about 1/3 of the site had been bulldozed in the meantime, which is quite unfortunate, but it was actually the bulldozing operation that created these rather high, 8-meter-high sections. And it was through these sections that the site was actually discovered as an archaeological site. Before, nobody had any clue that there was a Bronze Age site here. So in the very first 2 seasons, 2004 and 2005, we actually didn't excavate, we just cleaned the sections. So instead of digging down, we had to erect scaffolds and climb up, which is something quite unusual for archaeologists. But the sections already show that we have a quite complex history here and a surprisingly well-preserved architecture. Some of the walls that were visible in the sections were preserved to a height of almost 2 meters. And that is something quite exceptional for early Bronze Age, 3rd millennium sites, where very often you're just dealing with the foundations. In 2006, we had, well, a small war here in Lebanon, so nothing could happen. But in 2007, we went back to the site and started excavations, which went on with a few interruptions until 2016. As you can see from the plan here, we selected 5 different areas to get well, not a fully complete, but an as complete as possible view of the site. If you just excavate in one spot, you may have something unusual, periods may be missing, and so on and so forth. So our main focus of excavation, of course, was Area 2, located along these 8-meter high sections that I already mentioned before. This was actually a kind of rescue excavation because these sections were in danger of collapsing. So by digging down and using the soil to create some kind of supportive embankment around the section helped not only to preserve the site, but it turned out that Area 2 is, in fact, by chance, the area of the site which has the most impressive architectural remains. So we had another small area at the southern slope of the site, Area 1, Area 3, the southern central part, Area 4 at the eastern slope of the site, and Area 5 in the northern central part. So I believe with this diversity of excavation areas, we actually have a relatively solid understanding of the site, its architecture, and its the periods that are represented here. So it turns out that we have almost 2,000 years of history preserved here. The very earliest phase dates to the Chalcolithic, the first half of the 4th millennium. Unfortunately, this period was only excavated in really tiny soundings, about 1 square meter, and so on. So we know it's there, but nothing else can be said. We then have a hiatus spanning the second half of the 4th millennium, but the real story of the site begins around 3000 BC with what we call the early Bronze Age 2, then developing into the early Bronze Age 3. So our local phases 2, 3, and 4 actually are the main phases. We have another hiatus spanning the first half of the early Bronze Age 4. Then for the later early Bronze Age 4, we have a little bit of activities. We're going to see what that is later on during this lecture. And the occupation terminates with some Middle Bronze Age burials and pits, but again, nothing substantial. And after the Middle Bronze Age, the site was completely deserted until the very modern period. So what we call our Neo-Syrian period, not Neo-Assyrian. So during the Lebanese Civil War in the 1980s, the Syrians had a tank emplacement on the Tell, which unfortunately led to some damage. But you will see we still got enough from the Bronze Age level. So this occupational history actually allowed us to move into the early Bronze Age period relatively quickly. We didn't have to deal with large scale later period overburdens. So with actually a relatively limited workforce, we got, I think, a relatively good idea of the early Bronze Age 2 and 3 architecture. The dates that I just showed in the table, of course, are based on a quite large series of radiocarbon dates. I believe we have the second largest set of radiocarbon dates for the early Bronze Age Lebanon. Only Tel Arqa, excavated by the late Jean-Paul Tallmann in the very north of the country, has a larger data set, but together these two sites for the time being form the backbone. So Tel Arqa and Fadous-Kfarabida form the backbone of the third millennium chronology in Lebanon, but more recent excavations like Tel Quba, the new Spanish, Polish excavations at Tyre, for instance, the British Museum excavations at Sidon, of course, fill in additional gaps. So, as I said, I'm not going to dwell on the Chalcolithic period because except for a handful of sherds, we have really nothing to show there. So I will immediately start with the early Bronze Age 2 and 3. When we started excavations at this rather small site, I mentioned 1.5 hectares, we expected something like a Bronze Age village. But very soon, already in the first 2 excavation seasons, we realized that we were mistaken because the architecture that we encountered is not what you would expect for a village, but it shows actually characteristics of an urban settlement, a small urban settlement, but nevertheless, I am very confident that we can call it urban. So, for instance, in areas 1 and 4, we encountered remains of a surprisingly massive fortification, a wall that stretches along the southern and eastern parts of the site. And by pure chance, in both of our excavation areas, we encountered gates. The gate in area 1, unfortunately, is badly preserved. We have here on this photo the fortification wall in the background and a rather massive staircase leading up to a gate that was originally positioned at a higher level in the city wall. We have similar cases with gates located high up in the walls and reached by stairs in the early Bronze Age fortifications of Byblos, for instance. But here, bulldozing, of course, has obliterated the actual gate, so we just have the stairs leading to the presumed gate. In area 4, on the eastern slope of the tell, we actually have the wall again, a gateway with a kind of guard chamber and a kind of massive tower or buttress guarding the northern front of this gate passage. Interestingly, at some point, probably near the end of the early Bronze Age 3 occupation, the gate was blocked. So that's why it's a little bit difficult to see. So here is one of the blocks, here is another block, and so on. But so that was our first clue that something unusual was going on here. A village is not supposed to have a fortification, and a quite massive fortification in the first place. So that was a first clue. As I said, in our main excavation area, area 2, we encountered a number of various buildings. Here I just show the two successive phases of the early Bronze Age 3. In dark gray, we have the earlier phase, our local phase 3, in light gray, our local phase 4, both dated by radiocarbon dates between approximately 2800 and 2500. And again, the architectural layout shows something that you would not expect in a village. For the earlier phase, remarkably well-aligned buildings separated by narrow streets. Clearly, we are dealing with a planned layout here, and an effective use of the space, probably dictated by the presence of the city wall, the fortification, which actually required an effective use of space. These earlier buildings are remarkably well preserved. You can see here in the lower right, one of these walls. It's actually this wall of building 1 here, which is preserved to a height of almost 2.5 meters, which is, as I said previously, unusual. Inside these phase 3 buildings, we found a number of installations here, a stone mortar, for instance, stairs leading down from the street into the room, fireplaces, and so on. So especially buildings 1 and 2 that were most extensively excavated clearly show that we're dealing with domestic buildings. We have compared, sorry, I forgot. One of the things that is quite astonishing is the presence of rather massive stone bases for wooden columns. As you can see, these columns here, you see one row here. This is this one. You have more of these pillar bases in the corners of rooms and so on. These column bases are so massive that we immediately suspected they cannot just be used to hold up the roof. And we also had a surprisingly massive stone collapse filling these rooms. So we believe that we actually have multi-story buildings here with at least one upper story above the ground floor that we see here. That is again something that you would not expect in a village necessarily. The very fact that in the early Bronze Age we had multi-story buildings in Lebanon is very, very clearly demonstrated by a wonderful discovery made by the late Jean-Paul Tallmann at Tel Arqa in the north of the country, where actually an early Bronze Age house had burned and collapsed. You see the collapsed mud brick wall here. And this building actually had a ground floor and 2, I believe, upper floors. In this case, we have actually a similar situation with massive column bases along the walls of the building, which helped to support the weight of the upper stories. And very similar things are also attested in Sidon in the early Bronze Age. For instance, here, again, one of these stone mortars and a number of column bases along the walls. The concept of multi-story buildings is actually something that has not really been taken into consideration for the early Bronze Age so far. And especially when dealing with the tricky business of estimating population numbers, traditional calculations often give surprisingly low numbers because these calculations just take the floor space into account. If we, however, add additional stories, a first and a second story, much more people can be housed in these buildings. So I don't want to get into details here, but that is something to keep in mind. The pottery retrieved from these phase 3 buildings, again, support our conclusion that we're dealing with domestic buildings. We have the whole range of vessels for eating and drinking, bowls, cups, cooking pots, storage jars, and so on. So, yeah, I don't want to go into too many details here. Moving on to our second early Bronze Age 3 phase, our local phase 4, here shown in light gray, we see something interesting happening. First of all, almost all of these earlier domestic buildings are abandoned. Actually, they are deliberately infilled. Probably the upper stories were taken down and the rubble was used to fill the basement level. That led to the extremely good preservation of the walls. And on top, something unusual was built, a large single-room building, quite impressive, 6 by 8 meters in extension, and again with massive columns here. Originally, there must have been 15 columns. 2 are missing, but we have 1 row along the western wall, 1 row in the middle. The northernmost column base is missing, another row along the eastern wall. So this is definitely not a domestic building. We also found no installations like storage bins, fireplaces, and so on. This must be, let's be careful here, a special building. No indications of any religious use. We're not dealing with a temple here. We are probably dealing with something administrative, with an administrative function. And directly to the west of this columned hall, separated by a small street, we have another quite large building from the southeastern corner to the point where actually the building was damaged by bulldozing. We're dealing with more than 20 meters. And this building clearly was a multi-story building because we found a staircase here in one of these corridors shown here in the top right picture. So a staircase like that, I assume you wouldn't build just to go up to the roof. So there must have been upper levels. Interestingly, this building actually was already existing in the earlier phase 3, and in our phase 4, it was just rebuilt. So the walls were just heightened on the earlier foundations. And the size of this building alone shows that we are dealing again with something special here. And in some of the rooms that have been excavated, we have evidence of large-scale storage of agricultural goods, probably on a larger scale than you would expect for the use of one family only. So we're again tentatively suggest that this is again a public building, and we need to keep in mind that we only got the very, very easternmost part of it. The building clearly extended formally towards the north and towards the west. These parts, unfortunately, fell prey to the bulldozer activities. The columned hall that I just mentioned has, interestingly, very, very good parallels in early Bronze Age byblos. In our case, the building seems to be freestanding. In byblos, these columned halls are always arranged in a series of rooms. So, for instance, one of the large later early Bronze Age buildings from Byblos is shown here, and like this room and this room, in the fact that we have 3 rows of columns, and the dimensions also are an exact counterpart of what we have in Fadous-Kfarabida. So as a takeaway, we have close architectural parallels between Byblos and Fadous-Kfarabida. One other parallel is also noteworthy among the small finds. We have a good number of cylinder seal impressions on potsherds, on vessels actually. That is a feature that is very, very common in the early Bronze Age Levant. We have hundreds of those in the southern Levant, in Israel and Jordan, for instance. And gradually, Lebanon is also emerging as one of these glyptic provinces of the early Bronze Age. So we have among the impressions 2 main motifs, geometric motifs like a fine net pattern, and animal motifs showing a lion attacking an upside-down horned animal, probably a goat or an ibex, something like that. And surprise, surprise, exactly the same motifs occur in Byblos. The net motif shown here, the lions attacking upside-down goats, here in the lower 2 slides on the right. So it's not only the architectural parallels that give us an interesting comparison to Byblos, but also in the glyptic repertoire, we definitely have the same motives, and I believe in one rare case, even an impression of the very same seal. This is just a parenthesis. This is actually something quite unusual. While I said we have a good number of these cylinder seal impressions on pottery vessels, a remarkable observation is that we rarely have impressions of the same seal. But here on the left is one example from Fadous-Kfarabida. On the right is an example unearthed by Maurice Dunant in Byblos in the 1930s, probably. And I am very much convinced that these are impressions of the same seal. So again, this shows very close connections between Fadous-Kfarabida and Byblos. And we have, of course, to keep in mind that both sides are only 12 kilometers apart from each other. So it's actually a logical thing to assume that connections existed between these 2 sites. I don't want to go into the very complicated issue of these cylinder seal impressions, what they actually mean. Here on the right, on the left map, we actually see the early Bronze Age sites in Lebanon that have produced cylinder seal impressions so far, many of them just 1 or 2, but Byblos has 20 to 30, Sidon stands out with, if I'm correct, 46 impressions, and Fadous-Kfarabida actually has 15 so far. I said before, this phenomenon of impressing cylinder seals on vessels before firing is a wider phenomenon. We have, for instance, cases for this in Giza in Egypt, not on local pottery. The fabric of the vessels and the shape clearly shows that we are dealing with Levantine imports in Egypt here. So that brings up the whole issue of trade. The vessels that were imported from the Levant, and at least in one case with a seal impression, probably were used to transport liquids, wine or olive oil spring readily to mind. Tree resin used widely for mummification in Egypt may be another commodity that was transported. Here in the lower right of the slide, we see one complete vessel from Tel Arqa, a truly phenomenal discovery, because here we have a vessel with two different seals. The normal fine cross-hatching is used on the shoulder of the vessel, and the base has an impression of the lion attacking an upside-down goat. So here both of the most common motifs from Lebanon are combined in one vessel. And as I said, I don't want to open Pandora's box here. There is a very, very complicated debate about the use and function of these cylinder seal impressions. Some scholars say, oh, it's purely decorative. Others say, oh, it has a social meaning. Others even say it may have an administrative function, and so on. As I said, for lack of time, I can't go into this, into details here. However, there is one very, very interesting observation. I said several times already, these impressions on vessels executed before firing are quite common, but what is largely lacking are the actual seals. Amnon Bentor, in his seminal study of cylinder seal impressions from the 3rd millennium in Israel-Palestine, has actually speculated that the cylinder seals may have consisted of wood and therefore are not preserved. So I was very, very pleased in 2011 when suddenly we found an actual cylinder seal at Fadous-Kfarabida. And then we found another and another and another. And at some point, I really got very suspicious. I suspected the students playing a trick on me, but no. We have a grand total of 9 seals. You see 8 here. The 9th is actually only a tiny fragment that I don't show here. And the very interesting thing is why the students did not play a trick. These are seals that are not really well known so far. If the students would have smuggled things in, they would have come with traditional Mesopotamian seals and so on. These seals that we have here, and where we have also a few parallels in Byblos, for instance, show quite unique features. For instance, Mesopotamian seals traditionally have a lengthwise perforation to, let's say, put the seal on a string whatsoever. The majority of our seals are not lengthwise perforated, but have a small suspension loop at the top. That is something that has not been really noticed or has rarely been found previously. What is also interesting is that the motifs of the actual seals are very different from what we see in the impressions. There are a few parallels, admittedly. We have the lion motif, but here, interestingly, on this seal combined into one animal, a lion, and the upside-down goat is actually joined to the lion. But we have other scenes where we have no impressions so far. Here, a hunting scene, for instance, a human confronting a lion with a spear. Here, a standing male figure carrying something in one hand and brandishing a curved object in the other, and so on. Some rather probably animal protomes shown on this seal. So something quite unusual. So what is very, very fascinating here is the sheer number of seals that we have. And second of all, the fact that we even have evidence for local manufacture. Look at this seal, for instance. This is not finished. This is a blank, seal blank. The carver started something which probably was supposed to be a lion, but the suspension loop is not perforated, is still very rough, and let's say the carving was clearly not finished. The lion, if it is a lion, doesn't have a head, and so on. So whereas finished seals could have been carved anywhere and probably were carried around by people, it is highly unlikely that somebody carried around an unfinished seal. So we believe that this is evidence for local manufacture of the seals at the site of Fadous-Kfarabida. We have a number of other interesting features that actually point to trade connections with Egypt again. Also on sherds of transport or storage jars, we find animal head applications, these kind of ram's head applications. We have about a dozen of those from Fadous-Kfarabida. Further examples are known from Byblos and Kharayeb higher up in the mountains. And in Sidon, and surprise, surprise, we have the same phenomenon again in Giza. Here, the example from Giza, and again, not on a local Egyptian vessel, but on a vessel that, according to its typology and fabric, clearly is an import from the, in this case, Lebanese coast, we can say. So as we've already seen with the cylinder seal impressions, the connections between the Lebanese coast and Egypt in the early Bronze Age are there. And we can actually prove this also by a few, actually two finds from Fadous-Kfarabida itself. We have one tiny sherd of a stone vessel, and the stone looked very, very unusual to me. I took it to the geology professor here at AUB, who happens to be from Egypt, and he immediately smiled and said, "This is from home. This is porphyritic rhyolite, a stone that is found in the Eastern Desert in Egypt." So we are dealing with an imported Egyptian stone vessel. So we do not only have trade in one direction from the Lebanese coast to Byblos, as I mentioned, with these transport jars for liquids, but we have the opposite direction again with presumably luxury items like stone vessels being transported from Egypt to the Lebanese coast. And I do not need to mention here that Byblos, of course, boasts a large number of Egyptian stone vessels, some of them even inscribed with the names of pharaohs of the Old Kingdom. Another interesting feature is shown here in the lower half of the slide, a handle of a jar with, again, an impression, but an impression that immediately looks very, very different from everything else we have. Rather small motifs, and the impression, unfortunately, is very unclear. It was made in a very, very sloppy way, but a number of Egyptologists actually say, hey, this looks like Egyptian hieroglyphs. So we are dealing with either an impression of an Egyptian seal or an Egyptianizing seal, a locally produced seal using Egyptian hieroglyphs. But the very interesting thing is that the clay of the handle is the typical local fabric. So it was, let's say, an Egyptian seal used on a local vessel. So what do we make out of that? Does that mean that maybe Egyptian traders actually visited the site? I would be very hesitant to go that far based on one find only, but definitely the object itself is intriguing. That complicated trade transactions were conducted at the site is further borne out by an at first rather inconspicuous looking object, a little bar carved out of an animal bone, just 10 centimeters long, and so on. But you can see there are perforations in this bone bar, and the central perforation is most interesting because great care was taken to hit the point of equilibrium here. So a first perforation that was not finished did not go through entirely, and the second actually hit exactly the point of equilibrium. So I believe we are dealing with a scale beam here, and the small size of the scale beam shows that we are dealing with a weighing of small amounts of precious items, precious metals, spices, drugs, who knows. So the concept of weighing must have been around, and we have evidence for weighing at this time in Egypt, but the most convincing parallels actually for scale beams of the same size, more or less, are found in Anatolia and the Aegean, here shown in the upper right slide. So the presence of this scale beam in Fadous-Kfarabida again shows that, let's say, not just simple barter happened here, but that complicated transactions were conducted. Okay, going back to the architecture of phases 3 and 4, so the early Bronze Age 3 architecture. What is interesting, the earlier habitation buildings do not show evidence for cylinder seals. So the red dots here show the location of the find spots of the 9 cylinder seals that I just mentioned. And surprise, surprise, they are all concentrated in the area that we have tentatively identified as public buildings. So the columned hall has 1 cylinder seal, 1 was found in the street between the 2. That is actually the very damaged fragment, so that may have been discarded. But the majority come from this large building where we already tentatively suggested this is a special building for administrative purposes as well. So I think this concentration of cylinder seals in this one building is probably not accidental, and may suggest that these cylinder seals indeed play some kind of role for administrative purposes. Another small detail, especially the buildings that we termed special buildings also show special layout, especially the corners of the buildings are made out of rather large, well-dressed ashlars. So something let's say, creating a kind of special effect and so on. And interestingly, we have a few large stone hammers that very likely were used for dressing these stones. So again, in these special buildings, special care was taken to create an atmosphere of impression and so on, of let's say, I'm lacking a word here right now. So special care was taken to erect these buildings. When it comes to the archaeobiological evidence, there is again something interesting happening. For instance, we can't, for reasons of lack of time, we can't go into details, but here, for instance, this pie chart shows the distribution of various plant species in level 3 or phase 3. And what is quite interesting, the crop species are dominated by just 2 species, olive and wheat. Everything else is more or less negligible. Again, this spectrum is not what we would expect from a village settlement where, let's say, you grow a little bit of everything for your own use, but this is evidence of a specialized economy growing large amounts of cash crops, and that means Fadous-Kfarabida probably was integrated into a larger economic system. That brings us back to Byblos. So olive oil, of course, is one of the suspected commodities for export to Egypt. So maybe Fadous-Kfarabida acted as some kind of rural center in the hinterland of Byblos, where olive oil was produced on a larger scale, collected, sent to Byblos, and from Byblos shipped to Egypt. The animal spectrum, again, shows something quite interesting. Domestic mammals actually make up the majority of the species used. Hunting plays absolutely no role, 1% of wild mammals only, but given the coastal location, it is not surprising to have a rather large segment of marine species, mollusks, fish, crabs, sea turtles, and so on. So the sea provided actually quite an important part of the protein for the inhabitants. Just to go back once more to the crop species, here we have the spectrum of Fadous-Kfarabida. So with wheat, emmer wheat, and olive clearly dominating. And what is interesting, we have exactly, or a very comparable spectrum at the very important early Bronze Age palace of Tell Yarmout in the southern Levant, with again olive and emmer wheat dominating. Other sites show very, very different species compositions, and especially one has to say the farther east one goes, the more important barley gets, and so on. But clearly with Tell Yarmout and Fadous-Kfarabida, we have evidence for what I would call a specialized economy focusing on cash crops. Putting these results into a wider picture, So we have Fadous-Kfarabida here, Byblos here, as I said, 12 kilometers. Tel Kuba, another early Bronze Age site here. What is interesting is Byblos, for the time being, remains the only larger site in this central coastal strip. So I believe that actually Byblos controlled a territory stretching at least from Ras El Kelb, let's say a natural boundary, a rather difficult coastal passage in the south, to Ras Shaka, another obstacle along the coast, along the coastal plain, so that this area and probably going into the mountains as well, this may have been a territory controlled by Byblos, because Byblos, as I said, for the 3rd millennium remains the only substantial site with 5 hectares in size. Everything else that we have is much smaller and probably under the domination of Byblos. Moving on in time, I said that for the later phases, the early Bronze Age 4 and the Middle Bronze Age, something interesting happened here. The impressive architecture that we see from the early Bronze Age 2 and 3 completely disappears. The buildings fall into ruins. And for the early Bronze Age, we basically have pits that cut into the earlier levels, some of them quite substantial, actually. And so we have no real architecture. But what is interesting is that a lot of these pits are filled with fineware vessels, a lot of drinking paraphernalia, actually, small cups, a lot of them with painted decoration, jugs for pouring, and so on. There are even things like metal objects found in these pits. So these, according to our interpretation, are not simple garbage pits by some pastoralist nomads that camped on the site, but these are, I know this term has been stretched probably to its limits, but there is some evidence of ritual feasting going on with drinking and drinking rituals and so on. And I wonder whether this is some kind of memory stretching back to the earlier importance of the site, or whether this is just accidental because it's let's say a slightly elevated site, so it gives a good vantage point around the for the environment. But I'm more tended to think that there is some kind of memory going back to earlier periods when the site had a significant economic importance. What is also quite interesting is the early Bronze Age 4 sees a kind of different orientation, whereas in the early Bronze Age 2, 3, we had connections to the south, to Egypt, and so on. A few items show stronger connections to the north. One seal impression again, that in contrast to the earlier seal impressions we saw was not rolled on the shoulders of transport or storage jars, but on the rim of a courseware pot, a cooking pot, presumably, and similar impressions on courseware pots, on cooking pots, are found in Western Central Syria, with Ebla, Tel Mardikh, and Hama being the most prominent sites. So far, Tell Fadous-Kfarabida is the southernmost site of this kind of seal impression. Clearly something different, slightly different, in the motifs and the placement of the seals on the vessel than what we've seen earlier. A similar picture emerges actually for the Middle Bronze Age. Again, we have no evidence of real architecture, but tombs and pits. Many of the pits are actually stone-lined pits, some quite nicely done. Lots of them contained even almost complete vessels, but we also have 4 burials dating to the Middle Bronze Age. Here, one of them, for instance, with a nice assemblage of vessels, a Tell Fadous-Kfarabida juglet among them, and so on. And this is just to show you this burial was immediately adjacent to the large 8-meter high sections, and there you can actually see the damage done by erosion. So in 2007, when we encountered this burial, of course, on the very last day on the excavation, so we just took out the legs and 2 vessels. Then in 2008, we went back and continued the rest of the excavation. In the meantime, due to erosion, we had lost 30 centimeters along the section. So anyway, here a second burial, a stone circle with female 40 years old, again with an assemblage of vessels. Again, one Tell Fadous-Kfarabida juglet, and here, to our pleasant surprise, a scarab seal, not clear whether it's Egyptian or Egyptianizing, worn probably on a finger because it was found directly next to one of the finger bones. So a wealthy, probably, let's say a moderately wealthy tomb. And most interesting actually is the health status. Dental hygiene, terrible. A lot of the teeth, this individual has lost a lot of her teeth long before her death and so on. And on one femur, we actually had a rather nasty fracture, but this fracture actually had healed remarkably well. Medical doctors here at AUB with whom I discussed that show, oh, this is actually a very complicated fracture, so that needs some expertise for it to heal. So this woman was definitely able to walk after the fracture had healed, probably with a limp, but nevertheless. So just a small side aspect here. So what is also interesting, that among the Middle Bronze Age pottery that we find in these pits and tombs, we have Egyptian material as well, Egyptian imports. Now, the site does not have a convenient natural harbor, so I believe that these Egyptian imports very likely reached the site via Byblos, which was, as we know from Egyptian textual references, not only in the early Bronze Age, but still in the Middle Bronze Age, a very, very important staging point for Egyptian ships. And interestingly, we have among the Egyptian material things like cooking pots. So that again raises the question, is that evidence for actually Egyptian presence at the site, or did locals use Egyptian vessels here? That is again something I cannot really go into. There are definitely a lot of more things I could talk about, but I've already been talking about an hour for an hour, so I think I should stop here. I always stop with this rather depressing picture. So as you know, the current situation in Lebanon is very tense again. And that, of course, has a detrimental effect not only on the people, but also on the archaeology here. This summer, we had virtually no archaeological activities going on, and the fighting, at least in which for the time being is largely confined to the south of Lebanon, definitely has a negative effect on the archaeology there as well, not to mention, of course, the people. So let's just hope that things will calm down as soon as possible. So my very last slide here, of course, it should be obvious that all that I've presented here is not my own work. I owe a lot of this information to the various teams that worked with me on the site, to various specialists, the specialists in archaeozoology, in petrography, in metallurgy, in whatsoever, and so on. And of course, my gratitude goes to the Direction Générale des Antiquités of Lebanon for giving us the permission to work at the site, the American University of Beirut, the Gerda Henkel Stiftung, and the German Association for the Research of Palestine in Germany for financial support. And I should also mention that the first 4 seasons I co-directed the project with my colleague Helen Sader from AUB. And the last 3 seasons, from 2014 to 2016, I had Alison Damick at that time from Columbia University as my co-director. So I extend my thanks to all of these people.